I'm also head of school at Birmingham University, head of the School of Education there. And I want to really begin by saying that I don't have a slideshow, so there are no slides for you to look at. Catholic education is quite a controversial subject. And it seems today that if you have an opinion about anything, it becomes rather dangerous in a sense, when you make comments. So what I'm going to do really is I'm going to read much of what I've got here so as I can't be misinterpreted afterwards by people here. So I want to begin really by sort of giving you some sort of background to this idea of a Catholic idea of an institution. Now, we live in an age in which people rally around numerous and overlapping identities: ethnic, racial, sexual, political, national and religious. We seem anxious about our many and complex identities, and so lay down markers that we believe help answer the question, who are we? The questions we ask are essentially about difference. How are we different from others, and what difference does it really make? Should we and our institutions have a distinctive character that distinguishes us from other institutions in society? There are a great variety of ways by which these questions have been answered. But Catholics are rightly concerned about Catholic identity, about how we are perceived, and about what we really represent to the world. As Catholics, our identity is anchored in our baptism, which gives us each a common identity and a mission to evangelize. This Catholic baptismal identity is essential, enduring, and true, and has led us to develop an array of institutions: schools, hospices, and adoption agencies. Just the three there, and many others as well. And we try to ensure that these institutions reflect a genuine Catholic identity with a fidelity to church teaching. Bishops have a particular responsibility for Catholic institutions in canon law and must ensure that the Catholic faith permeates the culture of these institutions. Authentic Catholic institutions are therefore extensions of the Catholic community and of Catholic belief itself. However, there is a conflict between Catholics in the principles that are increasingly defined as normative by public authorities. This is not something new. These normative principles are no longer based on Protestantism, but on a materialistic secularism. What has changed is not the hostile environment that Catholics inhabit, but the experience and knowledge of the Catholic faith actually lived by Catholics today. Many Catholics experience a tension between the desire to be strongly identified as Catholic and the desire to respond to modern culture and life. It has led many to de-emphasize their Catholic identity and to live in peaceful coexistence with secular modernity. The less Catholic they are, the less useful they are to the mission of the Church. The less Catholic they are, the more secular public space becomes, and the more legislation forces upon Catholics policies that repudiate their faith. This is why I wish this afternoon to look within, to look at what we do as Catholics that sometimes repudiates what we believe as Catholics. By way of background, I believe very firmly that we live in a time of the self-defined Catholic who sees Catholic identity as a tribal designation. In such a tribal designation, being born into the tribe is what counts as Catholic identity rather than actually holding what an authentic Catholic believes. I want to look at three different kinds of institutions: Catholic adoption agencies, Catholic hospices, and Catholic schools, to raise some questions about their Catholic identity. I will begin by outlining what is common to all three of these institutions. All three share a similar historical development and came into existence in the context of a very Catholic subculture. Some have called it the Catholic ghetto. All three required the local bishop to designate and recognize them as Catholic, and it is in this canon law definition of what is a Catholic institution that effectively gives it the status of a Catholic institution. The purpose of their establishment was to serve a Catholic clientele, and as they developed, they became more professional and also more regulated by government agencies and legislation. All three experienced growth as a result of increased government funding. Many became staffed by non-Catholics. In some cases, the majority of the staff are non-Catholics. Their purpose has increasingly come to serve the general population rather than limiting their services to the Catholic population. As the Catholic subculture faded and internal changes within Catholicism developed, a number of questions were raised about the purpose of these institutions. Is it possible for these institutions to be Catholic today? Should they exist in our secular society? What does Catholic identity mean in these institutions? To the first question, it is simply assumed by members of the Church that Catholic institutions should and ought to exist. So how can you have a Catholic institution serving the general public, having a majority of non-Catholic staff and clientele, and receiving all their money from the government? Catholic distinctiveness or identity must refer to what is different from others and include some aspects of Catholic theology and especially particular intentions and motivations for what is done. Therefore, there must be tensions in what Catholics and others think when Catholic institutions try to be inclusive. Catholics naturally and rightly seek to have their institutions bear witness to the work of Jesus Christ and to serve all people. Therefore, we believe that our institutions are not only good for the Church, but are good for society. We are concerned with the dignity of the individual, the importance of the common good, and the concern for the poor. Yet much of what is often said about Catholic distinctiveness and Catholic identity can be accepted by others and is not necessarily unique to us. Take the example of these three institutions. Start with the Catholic hospices. Now, in our hospices, we prioritise the human dignity of every person and emphasise that each has intrinsic spiritual worth. But how do we ensure that these values exist in Catholic hospices? These hospices have become inclusive institutions, respecting the beliefs of Muslims, Christians, and people of no faith at all. They have opened their doors, rightly I think, to all. But what will happen when the assisted dying bill, or something like it, is eventually passed, and patients in these institutions decide to have themselves euthanized? Will Catholic hospices continue to say that they respect the beliefs of all who are admitted? Can such a hospice claim to have a Catholic identity if such anti-Catholic practices are permitted? Opening our institutions up to all has already presented serious challenges to us. How are we to remain faithful when we may be forced by law to tolerate and even facilitate anti-Catholic practices? Now, if you look at the Catholic adoption agencies, now these Catholic adoption agencies were a product of the late 19th century. I think in this context, it's really of note that Elizabeth I, during the time of Elizabeth I, Catholic children were often removed from Catholic families and brought up as Protestants. In the 1870s in London, children born to poor Catholic parents or single Catholic women who couldn't look after them were often taken and put into Protestant families and sometimes had their Irish names changed. This is Dr. Barnardo's. This is the history of Dr. Barnardo's. The movement to establish Catholic adoption agencies, spearheaded by Cardinal Manning, was motivated by a need to protect the faith of these baptized Catholic children. As these independent and diocesan Catholic adoption agencies became more entangled with the state and with state funding and regulation, the purpose of these adoption agencies changed. However, as Catholics also changed after the 1960s, these adoption agencies began to place less emphasis on bringing the children up as Catholics. Some of them did. And more emphasis was put on ensuring that the best married couple were selected. In other words, an argument for effectiveness. They wanted to be effective organisations. So these adoption couples increasingly did not have to be Catholic, and some were not even Christian. They simply had to be male, or a male and female couple, or sometimes a single person. By the time the gay marriage debate arrived, these adoption agencies were praised for being effective and outstanding organisations. But whether they were truly Catholic in their practices was not discussed at all at the time. They chose to emphasise the male and female couple as the only vehicle for adoption. No emphasis was placed on the Catholic faith. This was because adoption applicants did not necessarily have to be Catholic, but they could be a single-sex couple, but they could not be a single-sex couple. There is still a Christian fundamentalist and evangelical adoption agency in existence, and it's still able to operate. This agency emphasised Christian biblical principles and asked potential adopters to uphold these principles if they wish to adopt. The assumption, I suppose, being that single-sex married couples would reject such biblical principles. Catholic adoption agencies did not mount a legal challenge based on protecting the Catholic faith of the children it helped to find adoption parents for. Therefore, in what sense were these Catholic organisations? I turn to Catholic schools. Now, the ideal of Catholic schools was that they were established originally for Catholic children of Catholic parents to be taught by Catholic teachers. This, of course, was an ideal and was never achieved, and Catholic schools have always had non-Catholic staff and pupils in them. Today, though, the situation, I believe, is radically different. We have over 2,200 Catholic schools in England and Wales, 10% of the population, and yet 10% of the population is not Catholic. This means that 30% of the students in Catholic schools are non-Catholic, and 45% of the teachers are also non-Catholic. So the movement towards non-Catholic teachers and pupils continues apace, and the number of Catholic teachers in schools declines every year. There was some discussion this morning in one of the sessions in here about the connection between the training of Catholic teachers and Catholic schools. Well, that has actually been ruptured. There is very little connection between the training of Catholic teachers and Catholic schools in England today. So the demographics of Catholic schools are changing, which is and will change the nature of Catholic schools. For many, Catholic schools the emphasis has been on the school part and not the Catholic part. We know that there are many outstanding schools, but why would we want to defend an outstanding school if it was not also an outstanding Catholic school? Many of you will be aware of the Archbishop of San Francisco's attempt to strengthen the Catholic identity of Catholic schools in his diocese, and that this attempt has been attacked as being a violation of San Francisco's inclusive culture. The Archbishop said the schools were doing a great job in transmitting the social teaching of the Church, encouraging activism and outreach to the poor, but they needed to do more to present some moral doctrine in a more complete and compelling way. He asked rightly that why does it violate a teacher's conscience to teach the Catholic faith? If it does, then why is this teacher working in a Catholic school? Unless he feels in conscience obliged to teach against the faith. The language of the Archbishop introduced was not of his own making. It was taken from church documents that are accessible to everyone, the Universal Catechism, for instance. Yet people were surprised that these are the positions that the Church holds. Indeed, they expressed indignation that anyone would want to defend such teaching, or even worse, act on it. Sam Singer, a public relations operative with a reputation for aggressive tactics, was hired by these faithful practicing Catholics of San Francisco to launch a vicious media campaign against the Archbishop. A number of billionaires in San Francisco, rather ironic, wrote to Pope Francis asking for the removal of the Archbishop, writing that he was out of touch with the practicing Catholics he was assigned to serve. A public campaign in the press began against the Archbishop, and the students from Catholic schools demonstrated and marched outside the cathedral, demanding the Archbishop's resignation. I was actually in San Francisco at Easter and saw these demonstrations by Catholic pupils, Catholic students from Catholic schools, led by Catholic teachers, And the plaques that they had were the Archbishop was a homophobe, evil, down with, it was quite vicious and quite horrible, really. And these were kids from Catholic schools. So my question is, do these students know what Catholic teaching is? Or if they know what Catholic teaching is, do they accept it? The Archbishop has not given in to these protests, and I believe if you can resist the forces of secularization in San Francisco, it can be resisted anywhere. The bishop is an example to all bishops, and I'm pleased that the American bishops are certainly supporting the Archbishop of San Francisco. Now, there is clearly, and we had something of this morning, a drift to secularization. Make no mistake about it, there has been a drift to a more secular orientation in many of our Catholic institutions. The accumulated and incremental decisions of the people who run these institutions have led to secularization. This is not consciously intended. There is usually no statement to move away from Catholic teaching. There is also no single act that leads to secularization. It happens because Catholics become much more influenced by secular culture and are therefore unwilling, or simply unable, to defend Catholic teaching. The type of changes I'm talking about result when Catholic institutions do these types of things. First of all, they remove the word Catholic and replace it with Christian. This erodes the particular uniqueness of the Catholic Church's contribution. They talk exclusively about gospel values and remove references to the Catholic Church, use vague language about diversity and pluralism without explaining what they mean in the context of a Catholic institution. They appoint trustees or governors who are not primarily sympathetic to or uphold the Catholic faith in their lives. These can be both Catholics and non-Catholics. They obtain from secular sources most of their money to run the institution and comply with every regulation issued by the state and question every guidance issued by the Church. They are concerned primarily about secular inspections and the secular reputation of their institution. They see chaplaincy as a support service to the clientele of their institution, counselling and therapy for all, with pastoral care emphasised, but play down the distinctive religious significance of the chaplaincy work. They establish alliances with other institutions which are wholly secular. They have no specific contracts for staff and appoint them based on professional expertise defined by outside professional bodies. They emphasise social activism and downplay Catholic theology and moral teaching. And they allow numbers of Catholics to decline on the staff and among those that are served by the institution, effectively to lose the critical mass of Catholics that are needed to build the Catholic identity of these institutions. In summary, you secularize your institution by a series of small but cumulative decisions. This drift to secularize Catholic institutions goes on all the time. This is why we must resist such forces. Catholic schools are sites, or ought to be sites, of evangelization, and exist to evangelize the culture and society in which they are situated. They must not compromise their Catholicity, so they must be Catholic in their self-understanding and Catholic in their identity. What is taught, how it is taught, and by whom it is taught matters. Catholic schools are in their very essence profoundly ecclesial. They assist the Catholic faithful in educating students in the light of the Church's teaching, so that they are prepared for effective service to Church and society. We are members of a Church with a 2,000-year-old tradition, heirs of an enormous treasury, which is moral, artistic, scientific, spiritual, and intellectual. There is a Catholic take on reality, a uniquely Catholic vision of the world, a culture which has been shaped by reflection, action, service, official teaching, and prayer. G.K. Chesterton, the famous Catholic apologist, got it right when he said in the New Case for Catholic Schools, which was written in the early part of the 20th century, he insisted that every education teaches a philosophy, if not by dogma, then by suggestion, by implication, by atmosphere. Chesterton believed that a Catholic atmosphere should therefore seep into every nook and cranny of the Church's schools. If it is not an ecclesiastical ethos that permeates the environment, then a secular one inevitably fills the void. Thank you.